He told me to hold on tight, and Lord have mercy. I screamed so loud I think the whole county heard me. At 75 years old, with my knees that creak louder than my screen door, and hands that shake when I pour my morning coffee, I wrapped my arms around something I had no business touching and felt a rush so powerful it nearly knocked the breath right out of my lungs. For the first time in 50 years, I felt alive. Truly, bone-deep alive. My name is Cressida Miller, though most folks around Havenwood just call me Mrs. Miller now. Or sometimes just that old widow in the yellow house on Maple Street. I'm the woman who brings lemon bars to every church potluck, who never misses a Sunday service, who waves from her porch and keeps her yard neat as a pin. But that scream, that desperate, wild scream that tore from my throat, that was me too. The real me. The one I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten she existed. Now, I know what you're thinking. What in the world could make an old woman like me scream like that? What did I hold on to so tight that it shook me to my very core? And why did the whole town turn on me afterward like I'd committed some kind of mortal sin? Well, honey, that's exactly what I'm going to tell you. Every bit of it. The whole truth, from the very beginning to the very end, because this story deserves to be told. So come along with me now. Walk with me through this memory, through every moment of it. Stay with me through the good parts and the hard parts, because by the time I'm done, you'll understand why that scream wasn't just fear. It was something else entirely. Something I never thought I'd feel again at my age. It started on a Tuesday morning in late April, the kind of morning where the air still had that bite of winter hanging on, but the sun was warm enough to make you believe spring might actually come. I was standing at my kitchen sink washing my breakfast dish, looking out at the lilac bush that was just starting to bud, when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong on Maple Street. A deep, rumbling growl that made the window glass vibrate against the frame. I dried my hands on my apron and moved to the front window, pulling back the lace curtain just enough to see. A moving truck was backing into the driveway of the house next door. The one that had sat empty since old Mr. Patterson passed 6 months back. But it wasn't the truck that caught my attention. It was what was parked behind it, gleaming in the morning sun like some kind of metal beast. Black and chrome, polished to a mirror shine, sitting there quiet now, but somehow still looking dangerous, even when it wasn't moving. I hadn't seen one of those up close in decades. Not since a lifetime ago. The house next door had been empty so long I'd gotten used to the silence. No lights at night, no car in the driveway. Just the sound of wind moving through the overgrown grass in the yard. Part of me had liked it that way, if I'm being honest. Neighbors mean noise. Mean having to make small talk over the fence. Mean your business becoming their business. At my age, I'd earned my peace and quiet. But watching that truck unload, watching the movers carry boxes and furniture into a house that had been dark for so long, I felt something stir in my chest. Something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't excitement, exactly. More like curiosity. The kind of curiosity that makes you lean a little closer to the window, that makes you stay standing there even when your hip starts to ache from holding the same position too long. I told myself I was just being neighborly, just wanting to see who'd be living next door. That's what good Christians do, right? We welcome newcomers. We bring over casseroles and introduce ourselves. But deep down, I think I knew it was something else, something that had been sleeping inside me for so long. I'd forgotten it was there. Around noon, I saw him for the first time. Young, couldn't have been more than 30. Maybe younger. Tall and lean, wearing jeans and a white t-shirt that was already dirty from moving. He had dark hair that fell over his forehead, and even from my window I could see the way he moved, confident and easy, like someone who'd never doubted himself a day in his life. He laughed at something one of the movers said, and the sound carried across the yard, warm and genuine. I let the curtain fall back and turned away, feeling foolish. Here I was, a 75-year-old woman, standing at my window like some nosy old biddy watching the new neighbor. I had laundry to fold, bills to pay, a roast to take out for dinner. I didn't have time to be standing around gawking. But that evening, after the moving truck had pulled away and the sun was starting to sink low, I heard it again, that growl, that rumble that seemed to shake something loose inside my chest. I was sitting on my front porch with my glass of iced tea, the way I did most evenings when the weather was nice, and I watched him roll that machine out of the garage and onto the driveway. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at it, running his hand along the chrome like it was something precious. Then he looked up and saw me watching, and he smiled, not a polite neighbor-to-neighbor smile, a real smile, the kind that reaches your eyes and makes them crinkle at the corners. He raised his hand in a wave. "Evening, ma'am." I nodded back, feeling my cheeks warm even though I hadn't done anything to be embarrassed about. "Evening. Name's Cody," he called across the yard. "Just moved in today. Cressida," I said, and my voice came out softer than I meant it to. "Cressida Miller. Welcome to the neighborhood." He nodded, still smiling, then swung his leg over that machine and brought it to life. The sound was even louder up close, a roar that made my heart jump in my chest. And then he was gone, disappearing down Maple Street in a blur of chrome and noise, leaving nothing but the smell of exhaust and the echo of that engine in the air. I sat there on my porch long after the sound had faded, my tea getting warm in the glass, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Decades, maybe. A wanting, a hunger for something I couldn't even name. It scared me, that feeling. Scared me enough that I went inside and locked the door, even though it was barely 7 o'clock, even though the evening was still light and warm. I prayed that night before bed, asked God to settle my mind, to help me remember my place in this world. I was a widow, a grandmother, a woman who'd lived her whole life doing what was expected, what was right. I had no business feeling. Whatever it was I was feeling. But when I closed my eyes, all I could see was that smile. All I could hear was that roar, and somewhere deep inside, in a place I thought had died with my youth, something whispered, "What if?" The next few days passed in a kind of fog, where I found myself doing things I hadn't done in years. I started wearing lipstick to check the mail. I'd catch myself looking in the mirror more than necessary, smoothing down my gray hair, wondering when exactly my hands had gotten so wrinkled, so spotted with age. It was foolish. I knew it was foolish. But I couldn't seem to stop myself. Cody kept different hours than most folks in Havenwood. I'd hear him leave late at night sometimes, that rumble of his machine cutting through the quiet dark, and other times he'd be out in his driveway in the middle of the afternoon, tinkering with something. Music playing from a radio I couldn't see. He'd wave when he saw me, always friendly, always with that easy smile that made something flutter in my chest like a trapped moth. It was a Thursday afternoon, I think, or maybe it was a Friday. The days kind of blurred together back then. I was out front deadheading my roses, the ones that grew along the fence between our properties, when I heard his voice behind me. "Those are beautiful," he said, and I startled so bad I nearly dropped my pruning shears. He was standing at the edge of his yard, hands in his pockets, looking at my rose bushes with what seemed like genuine admiration. Up close, I could see he had his father's eyes. No, wait. I don't know why I thought that. I could see he had kind eyes. Green or maybe hazel. It was hard to tell in that light. "Thank you," I managed, feeling my face go warm. "They're Mr. Lincoln roses. Had them for, must be 30 years now. My grandmother grew roses," he said, stepping a little closer to the fence. "She always said they were like people. The most beautiful ones had the sharpest thorns." I smiled at that. Couldn't help it. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She was. Something flickered across his face, Something that looked like sadness, but it was gone so quick I might have imagined it. Listen, I know I've been making a lot of noise with the bike. If it's too much, just let me know. I can keep it in the garage more. Oh no, I said, and the words came out too fast, too eager. I cleared my throat. I mean, it doesn't bother me none. This is your home now. You should feel free to do as you please. He studied me for a moment, and I had the strangest feeling he could see right through me. Could see all the lonely years, all the quiet dinners for one, all the nights I'd sat on that porch wishing for something I couldn't name. You know, he said slowly, I was going to make some coffee. You interested in a cup? I could use some company. And I promise my place isn't too much of a disaster yet. I should have said no. Every ounce of common sense I had was screaming at me to make up some excuse, to go back to my safe, quiet house, and forget this whole conversation. But instead I heard myself say, "Coffee sounds nice." His kitchen was a mess of unpacked boxes and furniture that hadn't found its proper place yet. But he'd gotten the coffee maker set up, and the smell that filled the room was rich and dark, so different from my instant crystals at home. We sat at his small table, the one with the wobbly leg he'd propped up with a folded piece of cardboard, and we talked. Lord, how we talked. He told me about growing up in Colorado, about learning to ride when he was 16, about jobs he'd had and places he'd seen, and I found myself telling him things I hadn't talked about in years. About how I'd lived in Havenwood my whole life. About my late husband, Walter, who'd passed 12 years back. About my daughter, Rebecca, who lived in Omaha now with her own family, and called once a week like clockwork, but never seemed to have time to visit. That must be lonely, he said quietly, and there was no pity in his voice, just understanding. It is what it is, I said, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. You get used to it after a while. The quiet. Do you? He asked, and when I looked up, his eyes were fixed on mine. Get used to it, I mean? Or do you just get better at pretending it doesn't hurt? The question hung in the air between us like smoke, and I couldn't answer because I didn't trust my voice not to break. Nobody had asked me something like that in longer than I could remember. Nobody had looked at me like I was still a person, with feelings that mattered, instead of just a nice old lady who made good lemon bars. When I finally left his house that evening, the sun was setting, and my coffee had long gone cold. I walked back across the yard feeling strange, feeling like something had shifted inside me that I couldn't shift back, and as I climbed my porch steps, I heard his door open behind me. "Cressida?" he called out. I turned, and he was standing in his doorway, backlit by the warm light from inside. "Thank you for the company," he said. "Maybe we could do it again sometime." "I'd like that," I whispered, and I meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me. Like I was interesting. Like I was worth listening to. Like I was more than just some old woman waiting to die. The coffee visits became a regular thing after that first afternoon, though I tried not to let myself think too hard about what that meant. 2, sometimes 3 times a week, I'd find myself crossing that little strip of grass between our houses, usually in the late afternoon, when the light was soft and golden. He'd see me coming, and have the coffee already brewing by the time I knocked. We'd sit at that wobbly table and the hours would slip away like water through my fingers. I learned that he worked nights sometimes, doing security at one of the factories outside town, which explained the odd hours. He told me about his grandfather, a man he'd never met, but whose memory seemed to haunt him in ways he couldn't quite explain. There was something in his voice when he talked about family, a hollow note that I recognized because I'd heard it in my own voice plenty of times. We were both lonely, I realized. Just different kinds of lonely. But it was more than the coffee and conversation that drew me back. It was the way he'd look up from whatever he was doing when I appeared at his door, like my arrival had just made his whole day better. It was the way he'd remember little things I'd mentioned in passing, asking about my daughter's new job, or whether my hip was still bothering me. It was the feeling that for the first time in decades, someone actually saw me. Not the church lady or the widow or the grandmother, but me, Cressida. The woman I'd been before life had covered her up with layers of duty and routine and resignation. I started lying to myself about why I was spending so much time over there. Told myself I was just being neighborly, just helping him settle in, just being the welcoming presence that Christians are supposed to be. But late at night, alone in my bed, I couldn't hide from the truth. I was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely, and he made me feel less alone. The shift happened on a Wednesday evening. I'm pretty sure it was Wednesday because that was the day I usually did my grocery shopping. I'd come home with my bags and was struggling to get them all out of the car in one trip, the way I always did, even though my doctor had told me not to carry heavy things. Cody must have heard me because he came jogging across the yard, still in his work clothes, and insisted on carrying everything inside for me. He set the bags on my kitchen counter, and I busied myself putting things away, chattering nervously about how the store had been out of my usual bread, and I'd had to get a different kind. He stood there watching me, leaning against my old refrigerator, and then he said something about how my kitchen smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, like a grandmother's house should smell. It wasn't the words themselves that did it. It was the way he said them, with this note of longing that broke my heart a little. I asked him if his grandmother had baked, and he told me she had, right up until the end, right up until the cancer took her last year. His voice cracked on that last part, and before I could think about what I was doing, I'd crossed the kitchen and put my hand on his arm. Just a touch, just a gesture of comfort. But the moment my fingers made contact with his skin, something electric passed between us. I felt it clear down to my bones. He looked down at my hand on his arm, and then up at my face. And for just a second, maybe two, we stood there frozen. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could smell his cologne mixed with the scent of laundry detergent and something else, something male and alive that I hadn't been near in over a decade. I pulled my hand back like I'd touched a hot stove, mumbling something about needing to get the frozen things put away. He left a few minutes later, making some excuse about having to get ready for work, and I stood in my kitchen shaking like a leaf in a storm. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that moment over and over, the feel of his arm under my palm, the way he'd looked at me. What was I doing? What was I thinking? I was 75 years old. He was young enough to be my grandson. This was madness. This was dangerous. This was wrong. But Lord help me, it didn't feel wrong. It felt like waking up after sleeping for 100 years. The next morning I decided I needed to put some distance between us. I'd been spending too much time over there, letting myself feel things I had no business feeling. I was old enough to know better, old enough to recognize when something was heading down a bad road. So I stayed away, made excuses when I saw him outside, kept my curtains drawn so I wouldn't be tempted to watch for him. 3 days passed like that. 3 days of me trying to stuff that feeling back down where it had come from. And then on Saturday afternoon, I heard a knock at my door. He stood on my porch holding a paper bag, looking uncertain in a way I'd never seen him look before. He told me he'd noticed I hadn't been around, wanted to make sure I was okay, and he'd brought me some pastries from the bakery downtown because he remembered me mentioning I liked their apple turnovers. The thoughtfulness of it just about broke me. I invited him in because I didn't know what else to do, and we sat in my living room with those pastries between us on the coffee table. And he asked me straight out if he'd done something to upset me. I lied, told him I'd just been busy, hadn't been feeling well, the usual excuses. But he looked at me with those knowing eyes, and I had the terrible feeling He could see right through every word. He didn't push it, though. Just nodded and changed the subject, asking about the photographs on my mantel. And soon, we were talking again like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just spent 3 days trying to convince myself I could live without these conversations. When he left that evening, he paused at the door and mentioned that he was planning to take his bike out the next day for a long ride. Said the weather was supposed to be perfect, and he always thought better when he was riding. Then he looked at me with something in his expression I couldn't quite read, and told me he wished he had someone to share it with. Someone who'd appreciate what it felt like to fly down an open road with nothing but sky above and pavement below. After he left, I sat on my couch for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across my living room floor. That thing inside me that I'd been trying to bury. It was clawing its way back up, stronger than ever, and mixed in with the longing was something new. Something that tasted like fear but felt like possibility. I wanted to know what he was talking about. I wanted to feel that freedom he described. I wanted to stop being careful, stop being appropriate, stop being the person everyone expected me to be, just for one moment, just for one wild, reckless moment before I died. And it was too late. The thought terrified me. But it wouldn't let me go. Sunday morning I woke up with my heart already racing, even before I'd opened my eyes. I lay there in bed listening to the birds outside my window, feeling something building in my chest that I couldn't name. It was anticipation mixed with terror, hope tangled up with shame. I knew what I was going to do. I'd known it the moment Cody had mentioned that ride, maybe even before that. I'd known it in some deep part of myself that I'd been refusing to listen to. I got dressed slowly, my hands shaking so bad I had to try 3 times to button my cardigan. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw an old woman staring back, wrinkled and gray and foolish. What was I thinking? Women my age didn't do things like this. Women my age stayed home and tended their gardens and counted their pills and waited quietly for the end. But even as I thought it, I was walking to my closet, pulling out a pair of pants I hadn't worn in years instead of my usual Sunday dress. Church started at 10, and I'd never missed a Sunday service in longer than I could remember. But that morning I stayed home. I told myself I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't exactly a lie because my stomach was churning and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink and sat at my kitchen table watching the clock tick forward, waiting for the sound I knew was coming. Around 11 I heard it, that deep rumble that made my windows vibrate. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor, and before I could talk myself out of it, I was walking out my front door and across the yard to where he was standing next to that gleaming black machine. He looked surprised to see me, and I managed to get the words out before my courage failed. Told him I'd been thinking about what he said, about that ride, about feeling free, and if the offer was still open, I'd like to go, just once, just to see what it felt like. The smile that spread across his face was so genuine, so full of pure joy, that it made my chest ache. He told me he'd be honored, that he'd take it slow, that I just had to trust him and hold on tight. He pulled out a helmet from somewhere, an extra one he said he always kept, and helped me put it on. His fingers were gentle as he fastened the strap under my chin, and I could smell soap and coffee and something else. Something that made me feel dizzy. Then he was showing me how to climb on behind him, where to put my feet, how to lean when he leaned. My legs were shaking as I swung them over that leather seat, and when he told me to wrap my arms around his waist, I hesitated. It felt too intimate, too much like an embrace. But he was patient, telling me I needed to hold on, that it was for safety, and finally, I did it. I put my arms around him and felt the warmth of him through his jacket, felt the solid realness of another human body against mine for the first time in over a decade. The engine roared to life beneath us, and I felt the vibration through every bone in my body. He called back something about holding on tight. And then we were moving, slowly at first, just rolling down Maple Street past all the houses I'd known my whole life. Mrs. Henderson was out watering her petunias, and her jaw actually dropped when she saw me. I watched her face blur past and felt a wild laugh bubble up in my throat. Then we turned onto Main Street, and he opened it up. The world exploded into speed and sound and sensation. Wind tore at my clothes despite the helmet. Houses became streaks of color, and my stomach dropped like I was falling. I screamed, "God help me!" I screamed louder than I'd ever screamed in my entire life, a sound that was part terror and part exhilaration, and part something else entirely, something primal and alive and real. We flew past the church just as people were coming out from service. I saw their faces turn toward us, saw their expressions of shock and disapproval, and I didn't care. In that moment, I absolutely did not care, because I was alive. For the first time in 50 years, I felt completely, entirely, painfully alive. He took us out of town, down County Road 12, where the fields stretched out green and gold on either side. The sky was so blue it hurt to look at, and the sun was warm on my back, and I was holding on to this young man, and screaming my head off, and feeling more free than I'd ever felt, sitting in a church pew, or folding laundry, or doing any of the thousands of safe, appropriate things I'd done for 7.5 decades. When we finally stopped, pulling over by an old oak tree that marked the county line, I was shaking so hard I could barely climb off. My legs were jelly. My heart was pounding like it might burst right out of my chest, and I couldn't stop laughing. Laughing and crying at the same time, mascara probably running down my face, completely undignified and completely not caring. He asked me if I was okay, concern in his voice, and all I could do was nod because I didn't trust myself to speak. I wasn't okay. I was the furthest thing from okay. I was transformed. We stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, sitting under that oak tree while I caught my breath, and my heart rate slowly returned to something approaching normal. He didn't push me to talk, just sat beside me in comfortable silence. And I was grateful for that because I was too full of feeling to form words. On the ride back, I didn't scream. I held on just as tight, but this time my eyes were open wide, taking in everything, memorizing every sensation because I knew this was a moment I'd carry with me for whatever time I had left. This was mine. This memory, this feeling, this one perfect moment of absolute freedom. It belonged to me, and nobody could take it away. But when we pulled back onto Maple Street, reality came crashing back like a bucket of cold water. Cars I recognized were parked along the curbs. Neighbors were standing in their yards, talking in clusters. And when they saw us, the conversation stopped. They just stared. Some of them looked shocked, some looked disgusted, and some looked at me with something that might have been pity. I climbed off that machine with as much dignity as I could manage, thanked him for the ride, and walked back to my house on legs that still trembled. I could feel their eyes on my back, could practically hear their thoughts, could imagine the phone calls that were already being made. And as I closed my front door behind me and leaned against it, breathing hard, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Not because of what I'd done, but because of what people would think I'd done. Because in a town like Havenwood, perception was everything, and I'd just given them plenty to perceive. My phone started ringing before I'd even taken off my jacket. It was my daughter Rebecca, and I knew, without answering, exactly what she was going to say. I didn't answer Rebecca's call that first time, or the second, or the third. I let it ring and ring until finally, I just unplugged the phone from the wall and sat in my living room. In the silence, still wearing my jacket, still feeling the phantom sensation of movement, even though I was perfectly still. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from the ride anymore, but from what I knew was coming. By Monday morning, the whole town knew. That's how it works in a place like Havenwood. News travels faster than the wind, especially when it's the kind of news that gives people something to talk about over their coffee and their fence lines. I went to the grocery store because I needed milk and bread. Ordinary thing, and I walked those aisles feeling like I was on display in a museum. Conversation stopped when I approached. Women I'd known for 40 years suddenly found their shopping carts very interesting. Marjorie Peters, who'd been in my prayer group since 1985, actually turned down a different aisle when she saw me coming. The only person who spoke to me directly was young Tommy behind the checkout counter, and even he couldn't quite meet my eyes when he bagged my groceries. I heard the whispers, though, even if they thought they were being quiet. Words like inappropriate and disgraceful, and that poor old woman, doesn't she know how it looks, floated through the air like poison. I drove home with my milk and bread, and sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Cody's truck was gone. He was probably at work, sleeping off his night shift, completely unaware that he'd become the villain in everyone's story about poor, foolish Mrs. Miller who'd lost her mind. That evening, Rebecca showed up unannounced. I heard her car pull up and knew I couldn't avoid this anymore. She didn't even knock, just came right in the way she used to when she still lived here. And the look on her face when she found me in the kitchen made my heart sink. She wanted to know what I was thinking. Going off with some strange young man like that. Making a spectacle of myself in front of the whole town. Her voice was tight with embarrassment, with concern, with anger, and I understood it even as it cut me to pieces. She was worried about me. Yes, but she was also worried about how this reflected on her, on our family name, on the respectable image we'd maintained for generations. I tried to explain that it was just a ride, just a harmless moment of fun. But the words sounded weak even to my own ears. Because it wasn't just a ride, not really, and we both knew it. It was me stepping outside the lines that had been drawn around my life, and in a town like this, that was the same as committing a crime. She told me people were talking, that they were saying terrible things, that Mrs. Henderson had called her genuinely concerned about my mental state. She asked me if I was lonely, if I needed to see a doctor, if maybe it was time to think about moving to Omaha where she could keep an eye on me. The suggestion hung in the air like a threat, and I felt something inside me go cold and hard. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't senile. I was just a woman who'd taken one ride, felt one moment of freedom, and now everyone was treating me like I'd lost my mind. The unfairness of it made my throat tight with unshed tears. But I didn't cry. I wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Rebecca left after extracting a promise from me that I'd think about what she'd said, that I'd be more careful, that I'd remember my age and my position in this community. I agreed because it was easier than fighting, but the moment her car pulled away, I felt the weight of those promises sitting on my chest, like stones. That night I sat on my porch in the dark, and I saw Cody's truck pull into his driveway. He got out and started walking toward his door, but then he stopped and looked over at my house. For a long moment we just looked at each other across that strip of grass, and I wondered what he was thinking. If he'd heard the gossip yet, if he regretted taking me on that ride, if he thought I was just some lonely old fool who'd misread kindness for something more. He raised his hand in a small wave, and after a moment, I waved back. Then he went inside, and I stayed sitting there in the darkness, feeling more alone than I had in years. The next few days passed in a fog of isolation. My phone stayed unplugged. I stopped going to my usual places. I couldn't face the stares, the whispers, the way people looked at me like I'd become someone they didn't recognize. Even my own daughter thought I'd lost my grip on reality. The loneliness pressed down on me like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to remember. why I'd thought that ride was worth it. But here's the thing nobody understood. Here's what I couldn't explain to Rebecca or to anyone else in this town. That moment on the back of that machine, that scream that tore from my throat, that feeling of absolute freedom, it had cracked something open inside me. It had reminded me that I was still here, still alive, still capable of feeling something other than the dull ache of routine and resignation. And now that I'd felt it, I couldn't just pretend I hadn't. I couldn't go back to being the person I'd been before, no matter how much easier that would have made everyone else's life. Friday afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. I wasn't drinking when I heard a knock at my door. My first instinct was to ignore it, to stay hidden in my house like I'd been doing. But something made me get up and answer. It was Cody. He stood on my porch looking uncomfortable, his hands shoved in his pockets. And before I could say anything, he told me he'd heard what people were saying, that he was sorry, that he never meant to cause me trouble, that maybe it would be better if we kept our distance for a while, just until things died down. The words were reasonable. They made perfect sense. They were exactly what Rebecca would want him to say. But standing there looking at him, at this kind young man who'd shown me more genuine friendship in a few weeks than most people in this town had shown me in years, I felt something shift inside me. I heard myself telling him no, that I didn't want to keep my distance, that I was tired of living my life according to what other people thought was appropriate, that I was 75 years old, and if I wanted to have coffee with my neighbor, I was going to have coffee with my neighbor, and the whole town could think whatever they wanted to think. The words surprised me as much as they surprised him. But once they were out, I realized I meant every single one of them. He studied my face for a long moment, and then that slow smile spread across his features. He told me he'd put the coffee on. After that day on my porch, something changed in me. Or maybe it didn't change so much as solidify, like water freezing into ice. I'd spent my whole life being careful, being considerate of what other people thought, molding myself into the shape everyone expected. And where had it gotten me? Alone in a house that echoed with emptiness, surrounded by people who claimed to care about me, but only as long as I stayed in my assigned role. So I started going back to Cody's house for coffee. Not every day, but often enough that people noticed. Often enough that the whispers grew louder, more pointed, more cruel. I'd see women at church lean toward each other when I walked by, their mouths moving behind their hands. Young mothers would pull their children a little closer when I passed, as if whatever madness had infected me might be contagious. The pastor's wife, Helen Richardson, stopped me after service one Sunday in early May. She put her hand on my arm with that particular kind of grip that looks gentle but isn't, and told me she was concerned about my soul, that the devil works in subtle ways, especially with the lonely and the vulnerable, that I should be careful about the company I kept, the appearances I created. She said it all with this syrupy sweetness that made my skin crawl, and the whole time her eyes were hard as marbles. I thanked her for her concern and walked away. But her words stuck to me like burrs, because part of me, the part that had been trained from birth to be good and proper and appropriate, wondered if she was right. Maybe I was being foolish. Maybe I was letting loneliness cloud my judgment. Maybe everyone else could see something I was too stubborn to admit. But then I'd sit in Cody's kitchen with the afternoon light streaming through his windows, listening to him talk about his dreams of opening his own motorcycle repair shop someday, watching the way his face lit up when he got excited about something, and I couldn't find anything sinful in it. We were just two people who enjoyed each other's company, two people who were lonely and had found friendship. Why did that have to be wrong just because I was old and he was young? Rebecca called every few days now, checking on me with questions that felt more like interrogations. She wanted to know if I was still spending time with that boy next door, if I'd thought more about moving to Omaha. if I'd made an appointment with my doctor to discuss my mental health. Each conversation left me feeling smaller, more trapped, more desperate. The isolation was getting worse. My prayer group asked me not to come back for a while. Said they thought I needed time to reflect and pray about my choices. The woman who usually picked me up for our Tuesday morning coffee dates at the diner stopped calling. Even young Tommy at the grocery store had stopped making eye contact, probably warned by his mother not to encourage the crazy old lady. It was around this time that I started noticing things that didn't quite add up, little things that my mind kept catching on like thorns. The way Cody would sometimes stop mid-sentence and get this faraway look, like he was somewhere else entirely. The questions he'd ask about my past, questions that seemed casual but felt pointed. Did I ever live anywhere else? Had I always been a Miller, or was that my married name? Did I have any old photographs from when I was young? I'd answer honestly because I had nothing to hide, but afterward I'd feel uneasy without quite knowing why. It was like trying to remember a dream that slips away the moment you wake up. Something was there, something important, but I couldn't quite grasp it. One afternoon in mid-May, or maybe it was late May, the days were running together by then, I brought over a lemon cake I'd baked. He wasn't expecting me, and when he opened the door, I caught a glimpse of his kitchen table before he quickly moved to block my view. There were papers spread out, old-looking papers and what looked like photographs. He swept them all into a drawer with a casualness that felt practiced, but not before I saw something that made my heart skip. It was a photograph, yellowed with age, and even from across the room I could see two young people in it. The image burned itself into my mind in that split second before it disappeared. A girl in a summer dress standing next to a tall oak tree, and beside her a young man in uniform. The tree I knew. It was the old Patterson oak, the one that used to stand on the property where Cody's house now sat, before lightning took it down in the storm of '93. But it was the people in the photograph that made my hands start to shake. Because that girl looked familiar in a way that made my chest tight, in a way that made memories I'd buried for decades start to claw their way back up. Cody took the cake and thanked me with his usual warmth. But there was something different in his eyes now. Something watchful. We had our coffee and talked about ordinary things. But the whole time I kept thinking about that photograph, about the girl who looked so much like someone I used to know, someone I used to be. When I left that afternoon, I felt different. The unease that had been building for weeks had crystallized into something sharper, something that felt almost like fear, because suddenly I was wondering if Cody's arrival in Havenwood, his choice to move into that specific house, his friendship with me, if any of it was the coincidence I'd assumed it was. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to remember. There had been an oak tree. I knew that. I had a memory of standing under it, feeling the rough bark against my back, hearing someone's voice saying they'd come back for me, that they'd always come back. But the memory was soft around the edges, worn down by time and deliberately forgotten, and when I tried to grab hold of it, it slipped away like smoke. I thought about that photograph hidden in Cody's drawer. I thought about all his questions. I thought about the way he'd looked at me sometimes, with an intensity that felt like he was searching for something. And for the first time since he'd moved in next door, I felt afraid, not of him exactly, but of what he might know, of what he might want, of secrets I thought were buried so deep that nobody could ever dig them up again. I couldn't stop thinking about that photograph. It haunted me through sleepless nights and distracted days, pulling at threads of memory I'd spent 50 years trying to forget. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. with fragments of images in my mind. A young man's smile, the smell of honeysuckle in summer air, the weight of a promise that felt like an anchor and a lifeline all at once. But every time I tried to hold on to those memories, they'd scatter like startled birds. For nearly a week I avoided Cody's house, made excuses when I saw him outside, told him I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't entirely a lie because the anxiety was making my stomach churn and my hands shake worse than usual. But staying away didn't help. If anything, it made everything worse because now I was alone with my suspicions, with questions that grew bigger and more terrifying the longer they went unanswered. The town's judgment I could handle. I'd learned to live with the stares and whispers, had developed a thick skin out of sheer necessity. But this was different. This felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one more step would send me tumbling into something I couldn't climb back out of. It was a Thursday evening, I'm fairly certain, when everything came to a head. I was sitting on my porch with my Bible open in my lap, not really reading it, but needing the comfort of its weight, its familiar presence. The sun was setting in that particular way it does in late May, all orange and pink streaked across the sky, and I heard Cody's truck pull into his driveway. He got out, and instead of going inside like he usually did, he walked straight across the yard toward me. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. He climbed my porch steps and asked if we could talk. Really talk. And there was something in his voice that told me this was it. Whatever this was, whatever had been building between us, it was about to break wide open. I nodded because I couldn't trust my voice, and he sat down in the chair next to mine, the one that used to be Walter's. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything. The evening insects were starting their song, and somewhere down the street I could hear children playing, their laughter carrying on the warm air. Finally, he started talking. He told me he hadn't been entirely honest with me, that he had a reason for moving to Havenwood, for choosing the house next door to mine. My hands gripped the Bible tighter, my knuckles going white, and I felt something cold spreading through my chest. This was it. This was the moment I'd been dreading without even knowing I was dreading it. He asked me if I'd ever known anyone with the last name Thornton. The name hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath right out of my lungs. Daniel Thornton. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over 50 years. Hadn't let myself think it. Hadn't let myself remember. Had buried it so deep, I'd almost convinced myself it had never existed at all. My silence was answer enough. Cody reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out that photograph I'd glimpsed on his table, the one that had been haunting my dreams. He handed it to me with gentle hands, and I took it, even though part of me wanted to refuse, wanted to run inside and lock the door and pretend this conversation wasn't happening. But I looked, and there we were, frozen in time, impossibly young and full of hope. Me at 19 in my Sunday dress, the white one with the blue flowers that my mother had made, and Daniel in his army uniform, so handsome it hurt to look at him even now, even across the vast canyon of decades. We were standing under the Patterson oak, and his arm was around my waist, and I was smiling up at him, like he'd hung the moon and stars just for me. The tears came before I could stop them, running hot down my wrinkled cheeks, and my hands shook so badly, the photograph trembled. Cody's voice was soft when he told me that Daniel Thornton was his grandfather, that he'd grown up hearing stories about a girl his grandfather had loved, a girl named Cressida Hayes, who'd lived in a small Nebraska town, that his grandfather had carried this photograph in his wallet until the day he died, that he'd kept it close to his heart through everything that came after. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the arms of my chair, feeling like I might fall right through the porch floor. Daniel was Cody's grandfather. Daniel, who I'd loved with every fiber of my 19-year-old heart. Daniel who'd left for the war in the summer of 1968 and never came back. Daniel whose name was carved on the memorial stone in the town square, along with all the other boys from Havenwood who'd given their lives. Daniel, who I'd mourned until the grief nearly killed me, who I'd eventually forced myself to forget so I could survive, so I could marry Walter and build a life and pretend that my heart hadn't been buried in a jungle halfway across the world. But if Cody was his grandson, that meant Daniel hadn't died. The thought was so enormous, so impossible, that I couldn't fit it inside my head. Cody kept talking, his words washing over me like waves. He told me his grandfather had been captured, had been a prisoner of war for years in conditions that broke something fundamental inside him. That when he was finally released and sent home, he'd lost his memory, couldn't remember his own name, let alone the girl he'd left behind. That by the time his memory returned in fragments and pieces, years had passed. He'd tracked me down, found out I'd married Walter Miller in 1972, had a baby daughter, had built a life that didn't include him, so he'd let me go. Made the choice not to destroy my marriage, not to upend my world. He'd moved to Colorado, eventually married someone else, had a family, lived a whole life, but he'd never forgotten me, never stopped loving me. And when he was dying last year, he'd made Cody promise to find me, to tell me the truth, to let me know that he'd come back just like he'd promised, under that oak tree, even if it was 50 years too late. I sat there on my porch with that photograph in my shaking hands and felt the weight of 50 years of grief and lost chances pressing down on me. All those years I'd thought he was dead. All those nights I'd cried into my pillow. All those times I'd visited that memorial stone and traced his name with my fingers. He'd been alive. And he'd known where I was. And he'd stayed away because he'd loved me enough to let me have my life. The cruelty of it, the terrible, beautiful cruelty of it, took my breath away. Cody told me there was more, that his grandfather had left letters for me. Years' worth of letters he'd written, but never sent. That they were in a safety deposit box at the bank in Millbrook, the next town over. And that's why he'd had that key, that map. He'd been working up the courage to tell me, to ask if I wanted to see them. I looked at this young man sitting in my late husband's chair, this stranger who carried my lost love's blood in his veins, and I didn't know what to feel. The emotions were too big, too tangled, too overwhelming. Grief for what was lost, anger at the unfairness of it all, relief that Daniel hadn't died alone and afraid in that jungle, heartbreak that he'd lived his whole life carrying my memory, and underneath it all, a terrible, aching question. What would my life have been if I'd known? If he'd come back? If we'd had our chance? Night had fallen completely while we talked, the porch light casting long shadows, and I realized I'd been crying the whole time, tears streaming down my face, unchecked. Cody asked me if I was okay, if I needed anything, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Okay, I'd just found out that the love of my life hadn't died, that he'd survived and remembered me and loved me until his last breath, that everything I'd built my life on was both true and a lie, that I'd been mourning a ghost while the real man had been out there somewhere, breathing the same air, looking at the same moon, carrying me in his heart, just like I'd carried him in mine before I'd forced myself to bury that part of me so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed. How could I possibly be okay? I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't even pretend to try. I sat in my darkened living room with that photograph on my lap, staring at the faces of two people who'd been so sure they had forever ahead of them. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel. Not the boy in the photograph, but the man I'd built in my imagination over the decades. Sometimes dead, sometimes alive, sometimes a ghost that lived in the space between what was and what might have been. The letters, God help me, those letters were all I could think about. What had he written? What had he wanted to say to me across all those silent years? Part of me was desperate to know, to read every word, to hear his voice one more time even if it was just ink on paper. But another part of me, the part that had survived by learning not to look back, was terrified of what those letters might contain. By morning I looked like I'd aged another 10 years. My eyes were swollen from crying, my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped everything important out of me and left just the shell. I made coffee I couldn't drink and toast I couldn't eat, and I sat at my kitchen table watching the sun come up and wondering how everything in my life could change so completely in the space of a single evening. Rebecca called around 8. She'd heard something. I could tell by the tone of her voice, that careful way she had of asking questions when she already knew the answers would upset her. Someone had seen Cody on my porch the night before, had seen us talking for hours, had probably seen me crying. The gossip mill in Havenwood never slept, and my daughter had apparently been getting regular updates on my scandalous behavior. I told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. That Cody was Daniel Thornton's grandson, that Daniel hadn't died in the war, that everything I'd thought I knew about that part of my life had been wrong. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was tight with something that sounded like anger. She wanted to know why I was letting this stranger dig up the past, why I was letting him upset me like this, why I couldn't just leave well enough alone. She reminded me that I'd had a good marriage with her father, that I'd built a good life, that what happened 50 years ago didn't matter anymore, because everyone involved was either dead or too old for it to make any difference. Her words cut deep because part of me agreed with her. Part of me wanted to shut the door on all of this, to tell Cody to take his letters and his revelations and go back to Colorado, to let me finish out my days in peace. But I couldn't. The truth was a living thing now, and it wouldn't let me go. I told Rebecca I needed time to think, that I'd call her later, and I hung up before she could argue. Then I sat there in my kitchen with my cold coffee and my uneaten toast, and I tried to figure out what I wanted. Not what was proper or appropriate or expected, not what would make everyone else comfortable. What I wanted, the answer came slowly, like dawn breaking after the longest night. I wanted to know. I wanted to read those letters. I wanted to hear Daniel's voice one more time, even if it broke me completely, even if it made the last 50 years feel like a waste, even if it changed everything I thought I knew about my own story, because he'd loved me enough to let me go. And the least I could do was love him enough to listen to what he'd wanted to say. Around noon, I walked across the yard to Cody's house. My legs felt weak. My heart was pounding. But I knocked on his door with a steadiness that surprised me. When he answered, I could see he hadn't slept much either. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair uncombed, and he looked at me with such concern, such genuine worry, that it made my throat tight. I asked him about the letters, where they were, when we could get them, if the offer was still open. Relief flooded his face, and he told me we could go that afternoon if I wanted, that the bank in Millbrook was open until 5, that he'd been hoping I'd ask but hadn't wanted to push. We drove in his truck because my hands were shaking too badly to trust myself behind the wheel. The 20-minute drive to Millbrook felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Cody tried to make conversation, probably trying to ease my nerves. But I couldn't focus on his words. I kept thinking about Daniel, about the last time I'd seen him before he'd left for the war. We'd stood under that oak tree, and he'd promised me he'd come back, had kissed me so gently, like I was something precious that might break, had told me to wait for him, that nothing in the world could keep him from coming home to me. And I'd believed him. God, I'd believed him with every fiber of my being. For months after he'd left, I'd written him letters every single day. Long letters full of all the small details of my life, full of hopes and dreams and plans for our future. I'd told him about the dress I wanted to wear at our wedding, about the house we'd buy, about the children we'd have. I'd poured my whole heart into those letters and sent them off into the void, trusting they'd find him wherever he was. And then the letters had started coming back, returned to sender, unable to forward. And then that terrible day when the army officers had come to my parents' house with their sad eyes and their formal condolences, telling us that Private Daniel Thornton was missing and presumed dead. Presumed dead! I'd held on to that word presumed for longer than I should have. Had let myself hope against hope that maybe they were wrong, that maybe he'd come home after all, but he never did. And eventually I'd had to accept that he was gone, had to pack away my white dress and my dreams and my broken heart, had to learn how to live in a world that didn't have Daniel in it. The bank was a small brick building on Millbrook's main street, the kind of place that had probably looked exactly the same for 50 years. Cody led me inside, spoke quietly with a clerk, showed her some papers, and then we were being taken to a private room. The clerk brought out a metal box, set it on the table between us, and left us alone. Cody pushed the box toward me. His voice was gentle when he told me to take my time, that he'd wait outside if I wanted privacy, that there was no rush. But I asked him to stay. I don't know why. Maybe because I was afraid of being alone with this. Afraid that if I was by myself, I'd lose my courage and leave without opening it. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, bundled together with rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. They were addressed to me in handwriting I recognized even after all these years. Handwriting that made tears spring to my eyes. Miss Cressida Hayes, and then later Mrs. Cressida Miller, followed by my address in Havenwood. All of them unsent, all of them carrying words he'd wanted to say but never had. I picked up the first bundle with trembling hands. The envelope on top was dated March 15th, 1975. 7 years after he'd left for the war. 3 years after I'd married Walter. I could see from the thickness of it that this wasn't a short letter. Wasn't just a quick note. This was something substantial, something important. I looked up at Cody and saw tears in his eyes, too. He nodded at me, encouraging, and I carefully opened that first envelope, pulled out the pages inside, and began to read the words Daniel had written to me from across the unbridgeable distance of time and circumstance and choices that couldn't be unmade. My dearest Cressida, the letter began, and just those 3 words broke something inside me that had been holding on by a thread for 50 years. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send it. But I need to write it anyway. Need to tell you everything, even if these words never leave this page. I'm alive. I know you think I'm dead. I know that's what they told you. And for a long time, I might as well have been dead. The things that happened in that prison camp, they broke me in ways I didn't know a person could be broken. When they finally let us go, I didn't remember my own name. Didn't remember anything except darkness and pain. But I remembered you. Not at first, but eventually. Your face came back to me in pieces. Your smile, your laugh, the way you looked standing under our oak tree, the promise I made you that I'd come back. By the time I remembered enough to find you, you were married. I saw the announcement in the newspaper, saw your wedding photo. You looked beautiful, Cressy. You looked happy. And I knew I had no right to take that away from you. No right to destroy everything you'd built while I was gone. So, I stayed away. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. And I did it because I loved you. Because you deserved to be happy. To have a normal life with a man who could give you things I never could. But I never stopped loving you. I married, had children, built a life, and through all of it, you were there in my heart. Every major moment I thought of you. Wondered what you were doing. Wondered if you ever thought of me. I hope you were happy, Cressy. I hope your life was everything you dreamed it would be. I hope you had babies and watched them grow. I hope you laughed more than you cried. I'm writing this because my doctor tells me my heart is failing. But before I go, I needed to tell you the truth. You deserved to know that I came back, that I kept my promise, even if it was too late, that every day of my life since I left you has been colored by your absence. I loved you then. I love you now. I will love you with my last breath and beyond. You were my first love, my only love, and if there's anything after this life, I'll find you there. Wait for me, Cressy. Like you waited for me then. Wait for me. And I promise, this time nothing will keep me from coming home to you. Yours always and forever, Daniel. The letter fell from my hands and I couldn't breathe. Couldn't see through the tears pouring down my face. Cody's arms were around me and I was shaking, my whole body convulsing with grief, so raw, it felt like it might tear me apart. He'd loved me. Through everything. Through decades and distance and other lives lived. He'd loved me. And I'd never known. I'd buried my love for him. Had convinced myself it was a girlish fantasy. Had told myself that what Walter and I had was enough. And it had been enough. Or I'd made it enough because that's what you did. But now, sitting in this bank room, with Daniel's words burning into my soul, I had to face the truth. I'd loved Daniel Thornton, with a depth I'd never felt again. What Walter and I had was good and real, but it wasn't this. It had never been this all-consuming connection, and Daniel had felt it too. Had carried it through hell and back, had loved me enough to let me go, to stay away, to sacrifice his happiness for mine. The nobility of it made me weep harder. There were more letters in that box, years and years of them. But I couldn't read them. Not then. I sat in Cody's arms and cried until I had nothing left, until I was empty, and wrung out and fundamentally changed. When I could finally speak, my voice was rough and broken. I asked Cody why Daniel had never sent the letters, and he told me that his grandfather had said it would be selfish, that I deserved to remember him as he'd been, not as the broken man he'd become, that he'd wanted me to have peace, not regrets. But all I had now were regrets. Regrets for the life we never had, for the years we'd lost, for the love we'd been forced to bury. And underneath the regrets was a question that would haunt me. If I'd known, would I have chosen differently? I didn't know. God help me. I still don't know. I took those letters home that day, all of them, carried them like they were made of glass. For the next week, I read one each morning with my coffee, letting Daniel's voice fill the empty spaces of my house. He wrote about his children, his work, the ordinary moments of a life lived without me. But threaded through every letter was love, constant and unwavering, a love that had survived everything life threw at it. The last letter was different. It was dated just 3 weeks before he died, and his handwriting was shaky, harder to read. In it, he told me about Cody, about making his grandson promise to find me, to tell me the truth. But there was something else, too, something that made my hands shake as I read it. He wrote that he'd been wrong to stay away, that he'd thought he was being noble, protecting my happiness, but maybe he'd just been a coward, that maybe we'd both deserved the choice, deserved to know the truth, and decide for ourselves what to do with it. He said he'd wasted 50 years loving me from a distance when we could have had something. Even if it was complicated, even if it was messy, at least it would have been real. And then, at the very end, he wrote something that changed everything. He told me he'd left instructions with Cody, that if I wanted to, if I was willing, there was one more thing waiting for me. Under the Patterson oak, or where it used to stand before the storm took it, he'd buried something in 1967, before he left for the war. A metal box, wrapped in plastic, buried 3 feet down on the south side where we used to sit. He said he'd never told anyone because he thought he'd come back and dig it up himself, show it to me when he returned. But then everything went wrong, and he'd forgotten about it for years until his memory finally came back. Cody and I went there the next afternoon. We dug in the soft earth where that old oak used to stand, and we found it. A small metal box, rusty but intact. Inside was a ring, simple and gold, sized for my young finger. And underneath it, a letter in Daniel's handwriting from 1967, asking me to marry him, telling me he'd put this here for safekeeping until he got home. I held that ring in my 75-year-old hand, and I understood something I'd been too scared to face. that ride on Cody's motorcycle, that scream that tore from my throat. It wasn't about adventure or rebellion or some foolish attempt to feel young again. It was about freedom. It was about finally letting myself feel everything I'd buried for 50 years. The grief, yes, but also the love. The real, true, overwhelming love that I'd convinced myself was just a memory. I wear Daniel's ring now, on a chain around my neck where nobody can see it. The town still whispers about the crazy old widow and the young man next door, but I don't care anymore. Because I learned something that's worth more than their approval. I learned that love doesn't die just because we bury it. It waits. Patient and persistent, it waits for us to be brave enough to feel it again. Cody stays next door, and we have our coffee. And sometimes we talk about Daniel, and sometimes we don't. He's become like family to me, this boy who carries my lost love's blood. And sometimes when he asks if I want to go for a ride, I say yes. I wrap my arms around him, and we fly down those country roads, and I scream into the wind, and it sounds like grief and joy all mixed together. Sounds like a woman who finally found her way back to herself. My daughter doesn't understand, but maybe someday she will. Maybe someday she'll be old and alone and she'll remember her mother, who refused to stop living just because everyone expected her to. Who chose love, even when it was 50 years too late, even when it existed only in letters and memories and a ring on a chain. This is my story. This is what happened when I held on tight and screamed louder than I'd ever screamed in my life. It wasn't just about the motorcycle. It was about holding on to love, holding on to life, holding on to the truth, even when it hurt. If my story touched something in you, if it made you remember that it's never too late to feel, to love, to live, then share it. Let it travel beyond this little town, beyond these old walls. Because we all deserve to know that our hearts don't have expiration dates, that courage doesn't have an age limit, that love, real love, it never dies. It just waits for us to be brave enough to claim it. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories like mine. Stories about women who refused to disappear just because the world stopped seeing them. And tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know where my words found you, where this old woman's voice is reaching across the miles. Because in the end, that's all we have. Our stories, our voices, our refusal to go quietly into that good night. And honey, I went screaming.